In today's macro photography tutorial, we're going to be getting really close to some dandelion clocks to capture all of the detail on both ends of these tiny little dandelion seeds. So stick around and I'll get started in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux, and today we are taking a look at some dandelion seeds. I want to get really close, like super close up to both ends of a dandelion seed. So we actually have the fluffy end that makes up the ball of the dandelion, and then we also have the spiky end that fits into the head of the flower and is only released when the flower dies, and then all of those little seeds fly off to go and make new dandelions. So I want to get really close up, and that's going to be a challenge in itself. So I'm going to walk you through step by step everything that I do to get close-up shots of these dandelion seeds. So when you're going looking for your dandelion seeds, it's pretty much impossible to find a single dandelion seed out in the wild. They're just too small to see outside. So you're more likely to find them either still on a dandelion or maybe clumped up in a big fluffy ball like mine are here. Now this is no good to us. We need just individual seeds. So I'm going to venture into my little fluffy ball of dandelion seeds and just start picking a few of them apart. I'm looking for ones that don't have damaged fluff on the top. The bigger and more interesting fluff is always better, but you'll often find them with kinks in them. They'll all be different sizes. They'll all be dust and fluff attached to them. So you want to try and find a couple of really nice specimens. You just want to put those to the side and try not to lose them, try not to breathe on them because they will blow away. And then we need something to place them in to take our photographs. I'm going to be using our macro subject holder, which is this weird contraption here. It's got crocodile clips on 4 different flexible arms, which is really good for positioning those arms around, placing just a dandelion seed in one of the crocodile clips, and then you have a lot of flexibility of where you want to position your subject in front of the camera. Now we've got another use for this, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, but for now I'm going to set this up on my table and place one of my nice pristine dandelion seeds into the crocodile clips. So you'll see that I've got my camera out, which we'll talk about in a second, but I've also got my my seed sat in my crazy looking macro subject holder. That's going to keep it really steady as I position my my seed right in front of my lens. The other arms aren't being used for the time being, but I'll just move them out of the way anyway. Now that stability that the macro subject holder is going to provide is going to be really important. We're going so close up to our subject that every tiny little movement is going to be magnified just as much as our view of the subject. So that's why I've got my camera over here on a sturdy tripod. I've also got a macro focusing rail, and I think quite importantly, I've also got a shutter release cable. Now, if you don't have a shutter release cable, you can set your camera to timer, but when you press that shutter button at this type of magnification, even the act of pressing that button will give you a lot of camera shake. So try and go hands off as much as you can, whether that's using your mobile phone as a remote or using a cabled remote like me. It really helps to reduce any movement in your shot. The way that I plan to get my huge magnification factors today is by using a reverse lens setup. Now this is a really cheap and practical way of getting a lot of magnification without those huge price tags of a dedicated macro lens. It can also get you much closer than most macro lenses as well, so that's an added bonus. The way that all of this works is, firstly, we have some extension tubes attached to the camera. So this is an adjustable extension tube, so I can change this ring to move my lens closer and further from the camera. That's going to give me a little bit of control over how much magnification I actually want, and a little bit more control over my focusing. On the front of our extension tubes, we've got a thread, and that's going to match up with the thread on our reversing ring. This is a simple piece of metal with a thread on both sides. So you can thread that piece of metal into the front of a lens. You can then thread the other end into the front of your extension tubes, therefore reversing a lens. So the lens that we're going to be reversing today is a 28mm manual Tachyna lens. This is a really old lens with a manual aperture control ring, which is quite important to have. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to change your aperture because obviously our lens is reversed and there won't be any communication from the camera to the lens anymore. You won't be able to change your aperture via the camera. So when you're picking a lens to reverse, you can go to old second-hand shops and pick up these old lenses that aren't used very often anymore. They should be really cheap, and you're looking for ones that have that manual aperture control. So now that we've got our lens, it's time to screw it onto the front of our extension tubes. And that leaves us with the camera contact on the very front of our setup. It looks a little bit strange, but trust me, it works really well. So once you get your subject down in front of your camera, you'll start to notice a few things. Firstly, that stability factor. If your setup is even a little bit wobbly, your entire scene is going to be shaking around. It might even be that moving around, walking around your setup will shake it enough to ruin your shot. Next, your depth of field is going to be super shallow. This amount of magnification is going to give you only a fraction of a millimeter maybe of in focus area on your subject. So you need to make sure that your aperture is as small as it possibly can be. That's going to leave your images really dark. The other thing that'll leave your images really dark is that working distance between your subject and your lens. With a setup like this, your subject's going to be sat in the same place that your sensor would have been once upon a time. So that's really close to the end of your lens. It's going to introduce shadows, and it will make it very difficult to get light in between your subject and your lens. The way that I'm going to be combating that today is by using the Adaptalux Studio system. So we've got a control pod here on a little mini tripod, and we have flexible lighting arms to plug into these little ports on the front of the pod. And that's going to give us a light at the end of a flexible arm, just like our macro subject holder. Now we can add as many of these as we want, and it's really easy to position these lighting arms into that gap between our subject and our lens. So I've actually taken the magnetic diffusers off the front of my lighting arms because I want the maximum amount of light hitting my subject. So I've got two white lighting arm S's just undiffused, only maybe a centimeter away from the front of my subject. That's giving me a huge amount of light hitting my dandelion seed, and we need all of that light. I've got my aperture set to the smallest possible f/22 on this lens. I'm at ISO 320 and 1/50th of a second. So we're still struggling with our ISO a little bit, but I want the maximum depth of field possible with this setup. You can see that we're actually really close to this subject, but this is the furthest out that this setup will allow me to be. So we can get even closer to this if we want to. Now that stability factor is still there. I can actually touch my camera and you can see my heartbeat going through the image just with that tiny little amount of shake. So our shutter release cable is going to come in handy for when we take our image. Now there's one more thing that I want to do with this shot, and that's add a little bit of color into the background. I'm going to be doing that using our colored background gradient cards, which are nice little pieces of card with some colors on the front and back. Now we can use our macro subject holder to support one of these cards behind our subject and hopefully light it with another lighting arm from our Adaptalux Studio. So then guys, check out this final lighting setup. What we've got here is our two white lighting arm S's shining down onto my subject, which is really brightly lit. That's a massive amount of light falling onto that tiny little seed. So that's going to allow us to see the seed in the back of the camera and actually be able to focus properly. And you can see that as I shift my weight, it's actually just shifting that picture in the camera entirely. So you do need to be careful to make sure that you're not moving around too much. Now I've actually been able to lower my ISO a little bit more by getting a little bit closer, moving the lights closer into the subject as well. You'll notice that our background card is now nicely supported by the macro subject holder, and we have an addition of an extra lighting arm. Now this lighting arm looks a little bit different because this is a flash lighting arm. You'll also notice that we've got an emitter on the top of the camera now, so this is going to send a signal to our flash lighting arm to go off. Now the reason that I'm using a flash lighting arm to light my background is simply because the power that's required to match the exposure of this subject with these two lighting arms super close to the subject, and then the subject super close to the camera, that light has a very short distance to travel, and most of it is going straight into the camera. Whereas with our background, we need the light to travel from the lighting arm to the background and then to the camera as well. So we're going to lose a huge amount more light here, and we'd need probably 3 or 4 lighting arms just on the background just to match this exposure from the foreground. So a flash lighting arm gives out a huge amount more light, more power. So we're going to be able to light our background using our flash. So when I take my photo, we're going to end up with a little bit of green in the background, which can rival the super powerful LEDs at the front here. Now, using LEDs and flash together like this is not a common setup, but it does allow you to be able to see what's happening with your subject on the back of the camera, which is invaluable, especially when you're this close to your subject. I did mention that I've got a macro focus rail underneath my camera, but I'm not primarily using that for stacking my photos. That's a really easy way to change your focus. Just changing ever so slightly the position of your camera is a really nice way to get a lot more control over your focus in a setup like this. You don't want to be moving your subject around too much or changing the position of your lens. Both of those will introduce a lot of shake and a lot of variability in exactly where your composition is sitting. Whereas just moving your camera forward just a little bit can easily move your plane of focus through your image. Now the very last thing that I'm going to do is actually flip over one of these seeds and take a look at the seedling on the very end of it. They've got some really interesting spikes, and I think they'd be really interesting up close, especially at a magnification like this. So those spiky seedlings on the ends of the seeds are really interesting, just as much as the fluffy bits on the top, I think. The little spikes and the detail on there. It's just a pity that they're so small. For reference, they're only about 2 millimeters long, and we're blowing that up onto a 35 millimeter sensor. I'm not going to work out the magnification factor on that, especially because I've been varying it this entire time with my reverse lens setup and those adjustable extension tubes. But that is all that I've got time for now. So I'd like for you guys to let me know what you think to this type of setup, especially the dual flash and continuous light that I was using. I found it really interesting and really useful to get the extra power out of the flash to light my background like that, and it also helps to reduce any of that camera shake caused by my rather unstable setup. So for now, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.